All right. So it is my great pleasure to have Ge Wang here to talk with me. He is a great friend, fellow um, PhD student of Perry Cook, and it's I sort of when I was a grad student, I worked a lot in music information retrieval, but I was always interested in the making sounds and synthesis. And Perry was really into synthesis algorithms. And I was near the end of my PhD when I guess Chuck was born. And I kind of almost feel like I left when all the cool stuff started happening. And yeah, so let's start. I have a few questions and we'll see how it goes. So, one question is, when do you recall when was the first time you heard a synthesizer?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I I wonder if I'm really thinking back, it might have been like in a video game arcade, like in Beijing, in like I want to say 1983 was
Oh,
the first
wow.
time I think I've probably seen a video game, and probably I would say that's probably the first synthesizer. And I think by the definition, by some definition,
But,
I
oh,
think
yeah, yeah.
it
No,
definitely synthesized.
yeah, one of the things we have kind of looked a little bit into the class is there's this interesting overlap between the early synthesizers and then the early sound chips in like the first arcades and Nintendo game entertainment system. So they basically were using the same kind of techniques and kind of same know-how. Cool. And then did you play with this? I know you were more of a guitar player, but did you have a synth that you actually got your hands on at some point?
I think I did. So I think that first time I was very much an observer. I was like 6 or 7, and I think I was while I was it was the first time I saw a video game. I didn't even play the video game. I just saw the video game. I was mesmerized. I think the whole thing probably got me into computers in general. But that's probably the first time the synth. And then I came to the United States at the age of 9 in 1986. I want to say. So and I probably heard some 80s, good old 80s music, probably with some lot of synthesizers. I started playing with synthesizers, I think probably in high school. Definitely got like one of those like entry level Casio keyboards,
Right.
and I played a lot with that. I was able to find some software online back then. I think one of them was a noteworthy composer.
Oh,
Uh,
right. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
yeah, that
Noteworthy
was
composer. That
that
was
was
like
a,
an early MIDI sequencer kind of and
exactly.
notation program. No audio, just MIDI.
Just MIDI, and
Uh,
it was able to go to whatever the sound, like whatever sound blaster, like whatever the renderer was on the sound card. But it was,
right.
I think that got me, I think that's probably one of the things that got me into like computer music. I mean, as you said, I was playing guitar, but I was also just dabbling a lot on the computer with whatever software I could find. And so between the Casio keyboard and the and Noteworthy Composer, I think those were my
Those
early
were
foray.
yeah, the seeds. Okay, so let's talk about the birth of the enfant terrible, the Chuck. So Chuck is now like a teenager. I guess he is kind of the age of my son, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking might be even a few years older than your son.
Right,
Because I think by my calculation, this we're in 2023. This actually might be the 20th anniversary of Chuck.
right.
If you go by the first ICMC paper that was published. Um, I think yeah, um, it's definitely a horrifying thing. Um,
Yeah, the birth of Chuck. It sounds
birth of
like
Chuck.
a
a horror
cheap
movie.
like horror movie.
Yeah, I can say this is child's play. Like this is like the the doll that comes alive and starts like acts murdering people, which in a sonic sense, I guess Chuck is definitely capable
Right.
of
Cool.
portraying.
So, yeah. So one question I'm curious, I sort of don't know is, so in terms of more like programming languages and environments that were more geared towards music, what had you used for before you kind of came up with Chuck?
It's a great question. A couple of things that led to the beginning of Chuck. Um, One I think is in terms of other computer music programming languages. Um, at the time, I was using a lot of Perry's synthesis toolkit, so SDK, and so that
Right.
was in C++, and that made me really appreciate a lot of things about SDK, and made me appreciate not a lot of things about C++ when it came to timing. So
Right.
that tick function, right, in SDK, you had so much control over time, and because you could just count samples,
Right.
but because you had to basically like call tick individually or nest them or however you want to do them, you couldn't
Hmm.
you couldn't do the tick function like concurrently. You could do it all serially. And I
Right.
wanted to be able to write the equivalent of threads with the kind of precise control that the tick function in SDK provided. And I think that led me to realize, as much as I love C++, which I guess any of us who use C++ a lot, yourself,
Yeah.
I imagine, is
Yeah,
having a
it's a
love-hate
love-hate
relationship.
relation for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but I think that prompted me into like thinking about like, well, is it ever a good idea to try to make a new language? The answer is
Right.
probably no. But I remember going to Perry's office one day and saying,
Oh
Perry,
yeah.
you know how those go, right?
Yeah, yeah. I I I mean, yeah, like I think it's really we actually Perry was talking about that and he's like facepalm, not another, computer music language. Uh
Exactly.
and Yeah, and later on, I remember Ajay pitching to me his PhD and me saying, no, that's not a bad idea. So I guess there is something to be said about PhD students that persist despite initial resistance by their PhD supervisors.
Yeah.
But had you used at all, I would say kind of almost the more classic ones at that time period would be C Sound and kind of some variant of Max MSP or Pure Data. Had you used any of those before?
Little bit. Interesting fact. In my senior year in college, that was at Duke. So I've been programming a ton in Java and C++. I, I dabbled with Java and MIDI, like for my artificial intelligence class back in undergrad. I actually made
Right.
I made
Yeah.
a constraint based a MIDI music generator. It was like a polyphonic. It was like the most horrible sounding thing ever. And every time I was like trying to fix it to sound better, it would sound worse in a different way. And it was like the most amazing experience. But senior year is when I discovered kind of computer music languages. So I remember printing out like the 500-page manual of the C Sound manual to try to be like, I'm going to learn C Sound with this manual. And so I put it all in a binder. Then I never read it. I So I think the answer to your question is not much. Actually, I
Yeah.
have been aware of them, and I think the other thing that probably led to like actually Chuck that was related to all these other more like kind of classical computer music languages was actually I went to a symposium at Dartmouth. Um,
Hmm.
and at the symposium, it was all about computer music languages. I remember going there with Paul Patello,
Oh,
Taehong,
yeah, right.
yeah, with Paul and Taehong and others. We drove up, and I remember staying at John Appleton's home. He was so
Right.
nice,
Yeah,
and
he
he
was
wanted to,
such a sweet guy.
such
Yeah.
a sweet guy he was. And at the symposium where let's see, it was Max Matthews,
Right.
Barry Verco, C Sound, Miller
Right.
Puckett,
Yeah.
Pure Data, Max MSP, um, James McCarthy, Super Collider, like all the
Right.
kind of the
Yeah.
computer, like kind of the ones that were commonly used in that time.
Hmm.
And I remember learning a lot of I've definitely learned a lot about that. It probably planted this idea that, okay, maybe it's okay to make a new language. And
Yeah.
honestly, like so many of these projects began because, honestly, it's like we gotta get a degree, we got a project
Yeah.
to do, we got a
Yeah.
final project to do. And you begin doing these things because like these very practical
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, it's something that I'm really kind of, as I more and more I supervise, it's a tricky thing because, the classic adage of not reinvent the wheel, but wheels get reinvented all the time. And, we would have stone wheels today if they had not been reinvented several times. So there's this really delicate balance I find with graduate students where if you overexpose them to what's been done, it almost makes them filter their creativity and their ability to come up with new stuff because they get overwhelmed by everything that has been done before. But on the other hand, if you let too much free rein, then they're like, oh, here's this great idea. And you're like, well, that was done 10 times already in a much better way. So it's really interesting. That's kind of fascinating to me.
You know, I totally agree with that. It's a balance. But I remember Perry saying something like, it's like, what do I want from my grad students? And I remember some point towards the end,
Yeah,
he said, I want you all to do work that's fun, that's
yeah,
interesting, and that's important to maybe somebody.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's kind of it. And I think it was this. I think the real thing that got me going on Chuck is not even like what I wanted to do or even how I wanted to do it. It was kind of how I wanted to do it, but it was kind of like how I wanted to feel about it when I programmed.
right.
It was this like what I learned from that symposium, what I learned actually back in undergrad, writing a ton of Java and C++ code, just those two languages, made me really appreciate something about the aesthetics of programming languages, like how you
Yeah,
feel when you program in one language versus
mhm,
another.
yeah,
I found C++ was great and powerful, but it was like, running with like scissors and really more like running with chainsaws backwards
yeah,
down a hill. That's what C++
yeah,
is. It's very powerful.
right.
Java, like from a language point of view, there's so much that's like clearly been thought through. And I remember feeling like genuinely happy at times when I was working in Java after working in C++.
Yeah,
Of
for
course, I
sure.
went back to grad school and all we're doing is C++ because there's so much signal processing code in that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that symposium, what I took away from it was actually just this difference of aesthetics between languages and between graphical patching versus text-based languages.
yeah,
Um, Also, I learned so much just even though I didn't write a lot of code in these things. I mean, most of my audio code was like in Java and C++, but I
yeah,
definitely checked out C Sound. I checked out Super Collider. I was so struck by how on the fly Super Collider.
yeah, yeah. I still remember, like, I think, and it's kind of a bit lost with the transition that they had, but the original, like, McCarthy kind of super
Yeah,
collider, to me, it's a bit like Turbo Pascal 3, which was another, like, my first programming environment. And it was this very elegant kind of self-contained thing. It was like an IDE, synthesis engine, the language, everything was completely integrated,
yep,
which does have certain disadvantages, but in terms of workflow, it had this, like you say, a certain elegance and consistency that was really impressive. I remember Colby was a big fan of Super Collider at that time, and he showed me some stuff, and it was like, wow, and this is pretty interesting.
yeah, I remember that. And you're talking about like the SC2 days, right? Like
Yeah, exactly. Like
before they went to the
before.
server
Yeah,
architecture.
yeah, exactly. Um,
I
so, and that kind of brings me to the next question, which is, I mean, I'm pretty sure that when you first started Chuck, like you said, kind of in your head, you were probably mostly thinking about, I don't want to be programming in kind of bare bones C++. I want to have better control of time and sort of the parallelism concurrency. But my guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that live coding wasn't at the front of your mind. Um, so when did like, I mean, kind of the not the live coding of, oh, I'm doing a demo, but the kind of I'm going on stage and I'm typing on a keyboard and sounds and blips come out, and this is kind of a performance. When was your first experience with that? And was it SE2 that was I don't even know. I know that they did demos like that, but I'm not sure they did performances.
I don't. It was starting though. I don't think I saw anything at that time in SC2, and I don't know where this whole like live coding on the fly programming thing. When did that like enter my brain as a thing
Yeah,
as a thing to do? Part of that may be. I think part of that actually may is probably a couple of things. You know, it was right around the time a couple of different people around the world were starting to get this idea of like, you know, it's an aesthetic issue. It's like,
yeah,
is the person behind the laptop on stage? How do we know they're not checking email? How do
yeah,
we know they're not just hit play on iTunes and they're playing a game? We don't, and sound is coming out. So I think
yeah.
for me, live coding was kind of my own reaction to kind of what I thought was what I saw as computer music performance. And
Hmm.
others like Alex McLean, Nick Collins, like these folks, and they were in both in Europe,
Yeah,
I mean, like we've right around 2003, 2004,
yeah,
2002 is when like a couple of different people were all kind of reacting aesthetically to this way we perform. The other thing I
right.
would say, it may have came from the Chuck operator. I remember going to one of those early meetings where like it's like, Perry, what if we had this Chuck operator and you just kind of almost carelessly chucked things from left to right, you know,
Yeah.
one UGen to another, you can chuck data across the network, and it's all this kind of very live and very online, very on the fly way of thinking.
Hmm. Yeah,
And I think it was at that point that Perry was like, "Yep, this sounds pretty crazy." And then he said something like, "Go for it," or
yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. You know, it's to your point. Is that like I think I think Perry was like, "Well, yet another computer music language," but at the same time, I think he Perry like gave us room to explore, and I
yeah. And
really appreciated that.
yeah, and I think it's a really interesting space too, because you think like what I would call the old generation, like thinking of Barry Verco or Chowning, or all these people who kind of grew up with old school music 5 type languages. They really, it was a non-real time way of operating. It was a bit like composing with pen and paper, like you designed your sounds, you kind of assembled your score, and then you put it all, and then a couple of hours or sometimes days, depending, or sometimes minutes, but it was sort of, you created this big piece and then it was rendered and played on a nice system. And then it almost went to this other extreme of the what I would call the graphical patching environment, where it's sort of almost like you create a fixed set of interactions and everything reacts to what the performer does, but you're not building it kind of in a compositional way. And I think the live coding is some weird, twisted, happy medium between those two, that has some kind of interactive aspects and some compositional aspects and a bit of like radical transparency. It's kind of like a
Yes, that's a good way to think
open
about
kitchen concept type of thing.
it. I love that, the open kitchen concept. I think that's totally right.
Yeah. Now, speaking, I mean, being a bit nostalgic, I think also career-wise, Perry kind of started as an academic when me and Georg came. Like we were his first batch of graduate students, and I think to some extent he was, pre-tenure conscious of like being perceived more seriously for grants and other purposes. And I think by the time we were finishing, he had already sort of established himself more, gotten tenure, had collaborations. So he could be a little bit more, let's go for the more crazy things. So that's I think that was a bit of interesting dynamic at the time. But yeah, it's, and I guess another thing is you and I, to a large extent, rode the wave of probably the fastest acceleration in terms of hardware
Yeah.
that has ever occurred and probably will ever occur. Like in terms of every year, our laptops would become as powerful as the most powerful desktop of the previous year. And that has slowed down significantly to some extent.
Yeah, we were right on that. We were on the Moore's Law curve.
We were on the full on surfing that curve. Like,
Surfing
yeah,
yes.
I mean, yeah, it's crazy. So, so let's talk a little bit more about, the, I guess, teenage years of Chuck, or uh, over the last 20 years. One of the things that I find interesting is how over time, sort of, Chuck has become part of a broader software ecosystem. In some cases, using standard kind of connections like open sound control and MIDI, but in other cases, actually building up significant kind of infrastructure to enable it. And I'm thinking Tunity, which is Chuck in Unity. I know you've done some stuff with Faust. There's the connection with Wekinator. So are there others? And what are your general thoughts about sort of
Yeah, it's
interoperability and connecting with other stuff?
oh, a huge fan of interoperability. So yeah, there's Tunity, Chuck Unity, as you mentioned. There's Falk, Faust, and Chuck. There's WebChuck, which now Chuck runs in browsers now, and it runs
Right.
really well in browsers. And there's an
Yeah,
IDE.
I was playing with that recently. So are you compiling into WebAssembly for
Yeah,
that? Is that how it's done? Yeah.
yeah. There's and yeah, I mean, quite a few people in the Chuck community were trying to get Chuck going
Right.
using WebAssembly, and Jack Atherton, who is one of my PhD students who graduated actually 2 years ago. But it's in 2000, I'm going to say 2019 or so. Maybe even earlier, 2017. He succeeded in compiling Chuck in WebAssembly,
Right.
and using some of the new hooks that are now in web audio. Like those two things kind of came together, and now yeah, Chuck runs really well in browsers, and you get so many, and that opens such an even new set of doors for interoperability, because then you
Yeah.
can access all the world of stuff that's on the web. There's a vast world.
Yeah, and you avoid all the, on my Windows version X, when I try to compile Chuck, it throws that error about this library, and what do I do? So having that, the deployment issue, I think, is actually, and the ability to kind of use the browser as your IDE. So I'm quite excited, and actually some students have been in my class have been playing around with compiling into WebAssembly and web audio stuff and that kind of thing. Are there, like, is there any package that, if you had the manpower or someone interested, what would be your, I would love to interface X better?
Oh, people are actually working on this all the time. So right now, I mean, right now, we're trying to get Chuck into Unreal. So there's Tunity. Now we're doing Chunreal, I suppose.
Real.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
everything needs to come with like a really bad name, right?
right.
And as you know, like now we're just on the cusp of releasing like a new version of Chuck, and in there is going to be this new thing called Chai, which is Chuck and AI.
Right.
So we're starting, with some basic, some more, basic like machine learning things, which by the way, like having just taught a music and AI class, and we've been actually using your work from like 20 years ago, that paper you and Perry published, landmark paper on
Yeah,
feature extraction and genre classification. Um, there's so much advancement in AI right now, but like I guess I'm using some of I feel like what I've learned from the music AI class is that while AI have gotten really astoundingly competent, humans are just awesome.
yeah,
It's human creativity. And so using stuff like the more, kind of, I would say old school ML stuff with things like interactive machine learning, like, Rebecca Feebrink's Wekinator,
yeah,
it's unlocked so much creativity in an age where everyone's thinking prompt
yeah,
engineering and large language models. But those things are it's kind of like what you're saying. It's like, in a way, those have returned to the old days of computer music languages, which is
right.
almost like you sit down and you make the plan, you make the whole thing, you make the model, and it's like you're not in the moment of those things. You're kind of
Yeah.
planning those things, and then you
Mhm.
run it, you have a compute, and then you see the result. Whereas that middle part that we talked about, when things like, I don't know, Marcius and Chuck, when we were writing the wave of the Moore's law, things
Mhm.
became really live and interactive. And I feel like
Yeah,
there's still something in that. In fact, I feel like there's so much in that. So a lot of the stuff they're working on now in terms of the language is to not only support Chuck to help people do stuff with AI, since there's obviously so much interest, but to also do it in a way that's still aesthetically motivated. That's
yeah,
always been my jam.
yeah,
It's,
yeah.
so
Yeah, no, I hear you, and it's really interesting. Like I've done that a few times, but in many cases you can show that a little bit of synergy can go a long way to
yes,
get good
absolutely.
results. Like a classic example is beat tracking, which, you can people have done quite sophisticated models with deep learning and probabilistic models that incorporate knowledge of music, and they still occasionally will kind of get off what the beat would a human track. And you can show pretty reliably that um, even with a much simpler kind of old school beat tracker, if you tap a few beats yourself, it will kind of leverage that and then make a really good decision. And that's not a lot to ask in certain creative contexts. And it might actually also be, again, brings up that issue of interaction. And I think that that is really key in how we go about it. And
You can do a
also
lot.
probably, a big, like one of the things that, talking about kind of, yeah, that work was quite pioneering 20 years ago. Um, and even if we take a very well defined and maybe simplistic problem like genre classification, um, the state of the art systems maybe do 10-15% better in terms of classification accuracy today, while being trained in millions and while being, but they still, in terms of interaction, they do not change, they haven't changed that much. So yeah, okay, so switching a little bit, let's talk a little bit about kind of software design.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about your thoughts. We mentioned Super Collider, and I think there is kind of almost a design choice with advantages and disadvantages. In terms of one model, you have kind of a synthesis or sound generation environment, or that kind of is separate and operates, let's say, in a almost server mode. It just gets messages and then renders sound. And then you have a separate, sometimes completely different programming language that is designed to do patterns and various types of things. that sends messages to that synthesis engine. So that could be, I would say, the new super collider, the super collider 3 with the server model and the client model. And I've seen people like build things that are in different programming languages that talk to the synthesis engine. So that's an example of separating the sound synthesis from the control. Max MSP, they're sort of integrated. Like when you look at a patch, some parts of it are doing control and symbols, some parts of it are doing sound synthesis. Chuck, I would say, is mostly integrated. But yeah, I'm just curious about your thoughts on kind of that design decision.
Yeah, no, it's a good question for sure. Because so for Chuck, the part that runs the language, that's the Chuck virtual machine with its own set of virtual machine bytecode instructions, and there's like something like 150 currently like bytecode instructions in that's specific to Chuck virtual machine. That runs in tight synchrony with the synthesis engine. And in fact, we have, as you know, the thing called a shredder, which schedules your shreds in Chuck. And that's actually kind of, because Chuck is what we call a strongly timed language, whenever you deal with time or events in Chuck, that has implications for how scheduling is done. And that scheduling is basically saying, when does the language run versus when does the synthesis engine run?
Yeah.
And for that reason, those two things are always tightly coupled. And it's possible, of course, to run Chuck as a server, but that server needs to have both components tightly coupled.
Right.
You wouldn't really be able to separate out the VM from the synthesis engine. Those two things in Chuck are kind of very much tightly coupled. And I think what that gets you, I suppose, is, this really like set of, I guess, what we call like strong timing, whether that's a constraint or a benefit, maybe a bit of both, that you get with this. And I think is one of my favorite programming language quotes is by Alan Perlis. A programming language is not worth learning unless it changes something about the way you think.
Yeah.
It's like to say, I think it's the reason why we have so many tools is that, and I think there should be room for all of them. Back to your point about like, kind of like, as now we advise PhD students, and they come to us and they're reinventing the wheel and they're doing something again. But I'm really grateful for Perry for giving me and giving us the room to do things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm now maybe there should be room for this. And in that, you kind of realize Chuck actually does change the way you think. Just like if you're programming in Super Collider or Max MSP, you actually, the way you would go about solving problems, the way it makes you feel as you're writing code, for better or for worse, is going to be different.
Yeah.
So I think that, as I said, I think for me, the difference, the trade-off between, say, a client-server model and a very more monolithic model, is sure, it's going to change the way you approach tasks. There's a good chance that you can do whatever you're trying to do in either system, but you would do it differently. And the second thing for me, it's an aesthetic implication. Is that like what feels better to you, and that's a subjective question. And different people, one person, like this, and one person like doing it that way. Anyway, should be. I think it's good that I'm glad there is room for both.
I've been trying, so in this course that I'm teaching on synthesizers, which sort of mostly looks at implementation of different synthesis algorithms, but we also do look at different kind of implementations and how they work. And part of it is kind of a pluralistic approach where, we will take something relatively straightforward, let's say 2-operator FM, and look at how that is done in one environment, in another environment, in another environment. And it's interesting, like, some students find Max MSP and pure data really easy and kind of intuitive. Others absolutely hate it and find it really hard. But yeah, I hear you, and I think, even in big systems like Linux is an example where several times in its history it has been accused about being very monolithic and not flexible, but attempts have been made to make things that conform to a more flexible architecture, and they don't necessarily they haven't been particularly successful. So cool. So let's switch a bit gears. Another, I would say, major contribution of you and Perry kind of is the whole idea, which now has kind of propagated in many institutions, of laptop and mobile phone orchestras. So let's talk a little bit about that, how it started and how it's going.
Sure. Well, at Princeton, it's really it's Perry and it's Dan Truman, and that's even before my time, and I think it was when you were maybe earlier in your PhD, right? They were looking at, actually, I remember them looking at both kind of like how physical bodies make sound. And
Right.
so I remember them doing the embody experiments. They had microphone arrays that were looking at kind of how
Oh yeah.
produced
Yeah.
sound. And then at some point it was like, what if we flip that and
Right.
we could then emulate a point source, an acoustic point source. And again, I see everything, as you know, as kind of an aesthetic thing. And
Yeah.
I think they were looking at like, how does that change the way we engage with music, engaged with playing instruments, engage with writing music for those instruments? And how does this one thing of like, instead of this computer way of disembodying sound, you make a sound on your laptop and through wires, even wireless, your sound can come from totally like disembodied speakers around you or even far away.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, it's kind of like the client server model. There's an advantage to that.
Right.
You
Yeah.
can, once you decouple, you get a lot of advantages, flexibilities, but at the same time, like, there's kind of this idea of like, there's some advantages to regarding things as mutualized, is in the sense that we humans are physical beings, and we move through the world as physical beings. For example, if we're in the same room, which we're not, but we were, and you were playing, like, you just clapped your hand or you strummed a chord on a ukulele, I would be like, that sound's coming from you,
Yeah.
right? And that is it, and I can identify where that sound's coming from, and it's going, and I'm hearing the sound, some direct version. I'm also hearing the room of the sound going through the room, and it's a different way to like engage with sound. So I think Perry and Dan really like latched onto that and really were, I think, so I think that led to Dan's thesis, right? The bossa.
Yeah.
And I think that was it was like one channel in, but 12 speakers out, right?
Yeah.
That was sitting
Yeah.
on his lap. And I think at some point they were like, what if we, if in that one, like, what if we made an orchestra of these things? I think it was actually in Dan's thesis. So they went about starting the Princeton Laptop Orchestra, and
Yeah.
that was when Chuck was really just coming online, and this is like the first true battle test, as it were, of
Yeah.
Chuck. And it was Perry, Dan, Scott Smallwood, and myself in that
Yeah.
very first
Yeah.
instantiation of the Princeton Laptop Orchestra.
Right.
And it's one of those cases where I think we got through it because the four of us were kind of like, we're like, let's do this, but also because of just the courage and sheer creativity of the students that were in there. And I think they marched forward fearlessly, musically, creatively. And so that was kind of how the laptop orchestra, I think, in its current, as we might think of it, kind of started back in 2005.
Yeah.
And it really leveled up Chuck, and it really, because I remember living in like Studio B in Woolworth and just debugging and coding, and realizing what people need.
You probably was fixing bugs and recompiling kind of while things were happening, like between rehearsals,
Live,
Chuck
very
was
live coding.
changing. Yeah.
And then when I came to Stanford, it's like let's bring this idea to the left coast.
Yeah.
And and again, it's, I will say that there's a lot of things having done, so we started, so Prince Plork started in 2005. I came to Stanford in 2007, started Slork in 2008. And again, to your point earlier about like wheel invention, reinvention, and innovation and whatnot, this is one of those cases where like I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think what we had was really interesting, and
Yeah.
what was changing every time was actually what people did with this medium. And so
Right. Yeah.
I didn't feel the pressure to change up the medium. I was just like, whatever we had at Princeton, this is so much mileage. And
Yeah.
sure, there are probably many other ways to do laptop orchestra. So anyway, that's kind of the genesis, at least from my vantage point, of the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
laptop orchestra.
Yeah, and I mean, the traditional orchestra, of course, has changed, and instruments and the way things are done, and the way conducting
Yeah,
has changed quite a bit. But at the same time, a lot of the innovations happen without changing the format, so to speak. It's
yeah,
like the same instrument, same stuff. So, and for me, I think one of the things that I always found fascinating, I never had the maybe time or courage or whatever to try to organize something like that here. Scott is actually up in Canada. He's at Alberta, and we talk more frequently actually. But one of the things that I think is great is that it's sort of a more level playing field. It's almost like equal access, because the reality is that if you want to play music with an instrument, it requires a significant amount of training to get to even to a level of just playing with others, that in a way that you sound reasonable. And of course, not everybody can afford that training or has access to that training. But there's a lot of fun in playing in an ensemble. And I think that's something that these laptop orchestras are really cool. And again, it's a very different beast, I think, in terms of the requirements compared to, like, if you were trying to do a laptop orchestra with C Sound, or if you were trying to do it with Max MSP, or if you were trying to do it with Super Collider. Those influence also what you can do, what you cannot do, and how the students kind of work with it. So it's
absolutely. It's and I think laptop orchestras have been, I mean, they have been done with many languages. Now, I think even like 10 years ago, I think someone did a survey of how many laptop orchestras
yeah,
exist in the world. It
yeah,
was like, just at universities like 10 years ago, it was something like 75 or more.
yeah. And I would say it's probably like there's even the kind of more like laptop ensemble, almost like a chamber ensemble. So you get two or three people that are all doing in parallel. They're like it's not exactly the orchestra model, but it's sort of
The
more like
chamber model,
a
yes.
chamber or group model of the same thing.
And to your point earlier about kind of leveling the playing field, I totally agree with that. And I guess it's kind of, like Perry's principles for controller design comes to mind. It's like
Yeah,
instant music, subtly later. And
yeah,
the other one is that's so relevant to laptop orchestra is make a piece, not an instrument. So
hmm,
you're really concerned with how you want this thing to play and how you want it to sound. So you're not making a general purpose instrument that can play a lot of different pieces. You make the
yeah,
one instrument that's really going to work well for your specific piece and maybe nothing else. The other thing about the kind of like leveling the playing field is that at least in the Stanford Laptop Orchestra, and this is an ethos that I think I also felt back at Princeton was, you have people coming in from various departments. You have people coming in from computer science, people coming from music, you have people coming from, in our case, biology, philosophy, the business school, the
Yeah.
education school. And what we tried to do is to not specialize. We
Yeah.
asked, we were not like, hey, you come from CS, you do the programming, you come from music, no, we don't do that. You come from music, you do the composition, and no, we actually, like, everyone's got to suffer through the full stack.
Yeah.
From like conception to instrument design to sound design to composition to designing the performance to actually performing it. And at some level, this may seem less efficient, but one, I think it makes it so that everyone understands a more broad perspective on all of this. And also, like, it actually, strangely, I think, and maybe not surprisingly, I think it results in better music and more honest music. And it takes away from this, like, this almost like this feeling of, like, I want to call it imposter syndrome of that people, and everyone seems to have a little bit of it,
Yeah.
myself included. But like, people are like, I don't know music, or I don't know as much programming as someone else. But if you were to all have to suffer through it together,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
kind of are not trying to say this person is an expert and you're not in that. And so if everyone has to do a bit of
Yeah.
everything, it actually becomes anyway, it's been that's an aspect of the laptop workshop from an education point of view
Yeah.
that you've come to really appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's definitely it's tricky to achieve, but it's it's an interesting aspect. And
It's like, just for us, it's like, don't be afraid to be inefficient, and don't
yeah.
be afraid, if you make music that's honest to you, it doesn't matter what genre,
Yeah.
to our point earlier.
Yeah.
And you're like, a lot of things haven't changed about genre classification as a task in music information retrieval. And even 20 years later, while the models may have gotten a lot more complicated, humans still don't agree on genres. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the
Yeah.
big takeaways that you and Perry had, that I was like found it so fascinating. This is the humanistic aspect of the work, was that, by
Yeah.
the way,
Yeah.
our systems perform about as well as humans agree on musical genres. And
Yeah.
that says, anyway, I thought that was a wonderful insight.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we wrestled with a lot of the questions that everybody's wrestling today, with all the AI hype that's being thrown
Yeah.
around. So for sure, yeah. Um, cool. So I guess we touched a bit on this already, but what are sort of so there's a major release coming. What are some of the Chuck highlights for the future?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm going to go to the release notes. It's in GitHub. So let me take a quick look to make sure I don't miss the big ones. And while I'm doing this, to quickly add, just to what you're saying about the mobile phone auction, to connect kind of Chuck's teenage years, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, it was a laptop orchestra. Then, I came to Stanford, and then that's when the iPhone was released, right?
Right.
And back in 2000, announced in 2006, released in 2007. App Store came on in 2008. I remember this very clearly because it really coincided with finishing up at Princeton, starting at Stanford, and then co-founding Smule.
I
That was
know.
those 3 years were like a lot of things were happening. So at some point there was Chip, which is Chuck on the iPhone.
Mhm.
And then MoFo, the Mobile Phone
Of
Orchestra, and
course,
another
yes.
instance of name-driven, pun-driven, name-driven research. Here, let me go to the notes here. And so, the Mobile Phone Orchestra really started around then. Was to be like, let's take the laptop orchestra idea with mobile phones. But then, of course, I was helping to design like playful musical toys for mobile device, and so when things like Ocarina and Magic Piano came online.
Right.
So anyways, that's kind of that era, like almost like 15 years ago. I can't believe it's
I
been
know, it's crazy.
that long.
Yeah.
So Chuck 1.5, I think is not released yet, but it will be hopefully in the next. Actually, it's going to be days to weeks before this comes out. It's the big focus of this is actually Chai. It's a set of kind of these more like I would say these more like more old school, starting with ML
Yep.
tools, everything from KNN to SVMs, a lot of three-letter acronyms.
Yeah.
To Wekinator, we have a Word2Vec thing you can play with. It's one of the assignments I give to students. It's like make a interactive poetry generator tool for yourself
Yeah.
using Word2Vec. We have a multi-layer perceptron if you want to do some like kind of I guess what Rebecca may have called small data approach
Yes. Yeah.
to and I think it's so interesting. You can do so much with a lot of data, and you actually can do so much with not a lot of data.
Yep.
So Wekinator, so the whole object is in there. There's MLP, Word2Vec, 2 versions of KNN. Let's see. Let me actually even just look at the example files here, Chuck, and you can kind of see what I'm looking at here. If you see, what am I even looking at? So AI, HMM, MLP, PCA, SVM.
Yeah.
It's going to release.
You're implementing Marcias and Chuck.
It's pretty much Marcias and Chuck. We actually definitely looked at Marcias.
I always wanted to do, speaking of funny acronyms, I had this goal of kind of doing muck, which would be
muck.
Chuck in Marcias, and put some synthesis and kind of put some abstractions, because Marcias also has kind of a tick concept. And then I had some ideas of how one could go about it. But yeah, that's kind of fun. That's so interesting.
This is a good point from me to also say thank you for Marcias. Definitely looked at Marcias. Actually, a lot of the feature extractors that we have that's in here, come right out of Marcias. And also like my students have to. I do ask them to go read the paper from 2001 because it's such a classic. And I have to say, like, the paper does a really good job. I mean, not only that paper kind of started in many ways, the MIR community kind of kickstarted it. I think for the record, I feel like you and Perry had much more of a humanistic approach to it. That was apparent in the way that you talked about things, even though it was a highly technical. And I wish the MIR community, they took that as well, in addition to the technical side.
Yeah, I think definitely, I would say they have as a community, whether the paper itself, like, one of the things that I kept mentioning in the paper is that this is more a way of trying to see if, we can get some information about the underlying music, not necessarily as a task that's the end goal.
Right.
And also kind of trying to move to leveraging knowledge that we had about music. But yeah, it was a very, very different world for sure. Like, I still remember, now this paper has, I don't know, thousands of citations. It's like this massive thing. But I remember saying to Perry, I'm going to submit this to the Transactions of Audio, Speech, and Language Processing because that's a prestigious journal and it will be good for my career. And I remember Perry being like, cool, I'm all behind you. Just, it is going to be a bit of a stretch for them because it's not the typical thing they deal. So, don't take it personally if it gets rejected. Now that I am a supervisor, I can see exactly where he was coming from. He was trying to sort of say, so you never know. This is it was a very lucky timing. But yeah, thanks for saying that. I've always, tried to think about it in terms of like how can we use these tools to do stuff that's interesting and to appreciate, like you said, to really appreciate how complex and interesting human beings are.
Yeah.
Like this is something that, when you build an AI model, um, it's a very different perspective if you're doing it, if I try to make a model of a bird to highlight how challenging bird flight is and how complicated and how we can only capture aspects of it, it's a very different angle than I'm trying to replace birds with something mechanical, which is a lot of the modern AI kind of mindset, is very much confrontational and sort of let's beat the human at whatever task or come up with a way of showing that our algorithm does as well or better than humans at these very artificial tasks, where I think that misses the point a little bit.
I
So
see.
I'm really interested in the creative uses, and that's really cool. Um, good. Well, yeah, I think everything old is new, everything new is old.
That's exactly right.
People are listening to LPs, and they're playing with Eurorack setups, and you know, maybe all this stuff. And I don't know, Chuck is both old and young. Is kind of a teenager.
Yeah,
So
everything everything new is old and everything new old is new. It's so right. We go into these cycles and interest, yeah, what's happening with all this AI like hype and actually reminds me of the old days,
yeah,
not the new.
it's gonna go for a big crash. I'm absolutely convinced it's like heading there pretty
It's
quickly.
it's exactly what you said. It is the Turing trap. We've got ourselves on this way of
Yeah.
thinking like that's the benchmark if we can make it indistinguishable from humans. But oh man, this times like this when I'm really glad for like our lab and for Perry and for people like you and Rebecca and Perry, who I
Yeah.
think, I went into Perry's lab and one of the first things I saw was like, here's my PhD advisor, and he's like holding the coffee mug and and playing like an instrument. I'm like, is this research? And then I was like, can this be research? And
Yeah.
that made me feel so free to like, play. And and I think that's been the antidote, at least part of the elixir for us when it came to music and AI, and probably to the next part of Chuck, which is not just getting AI into Chuck, is like I think we want to create a way of working in this very
Mhm.
interactive, dynamic, live way to kind of underscore that, I think the elixir to this big red button kind of AI hype Turing trap is to help people remind ourselves that we're
Yeah.
creative, we're interactive, we're
Yeah.
physical, we're
Yeah.
playful. And I ask my students to build things that are like, in fact, I tell them like, don't worry about making things useful. Useful is fine. It's good
Yeah.
when it actually is, but make it playful no matter what
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah.
Whimsical is good.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like, all of that goes back to like to Princeton Sound Lab, and it goes back to the ethos. And I think
Yeah.
Chuck, in many ways, since that's why we're talking, I guess, ostensibly, is I think has always at least tried to kind of be playful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think I I try, but I don't think I'm as successful. But like Barry has this, childlike delight and curiosity about and playfulness about knowledge that is really inspiring and very yeah. I don't yeah, it's without sacrificing sort of rigor, right? It's like there's a bit of tendency also, if you to just like, okay, I'm just being creative, but yeah, I think it was a perfect balance, and he
And
was
if I
a great mentor for
just
sure.
to throw it out there, the moment I saw you on Zoom today, I felt so at home.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's Perry, but it's like it's the
Yeah,
people. We were all
we're
kind of,
all kind of
I don't
yeah,
know,
academic children. Or
academic children, but I think it's all there's maybe somehow Perry like found us and brought us together in a way that is like what you said about Perry. I would say that about you. I would say that about Rebecca.
yeah,
And I would say that, about Georg, even though
yeah,
he's a totally different animal, but everyone is, like there's things to say about kind of research when it comes to computer music and machine learning and HCI, and computing and music, but everyone has this very, I don't know, critical and playful
yeah,
mindset. Anyway, that's the one thing I try to, as a supervisor now, I'm trying to just like, I think it's in everyone. I'm just trying to unlock it in my students, tell them it's okay to play.
yeah, yeah. No, I definitely want to be there. I'm not sure I'm very as good at it for sure. It's a constant, it's a work in progress.
Me too. Same here.
And yeah, and I admire, like, in some ways, with Marcias has been in a bit of a hiatus for a relatively long time, like very little new development. It's there, it sort of works. If you we occasionally do small fixes, but I haven't done anything major, and that's combination of a lot of things. But I know that keeping on top of software is a very time-consuming activity, and in many cases, I'm thankful, but also very important. So I admire that you're going strong with Chuck and still involved and have people working on it and all that.
It's been really interesting because I think Chuck went on probably a multi-year hiatus itself.
Yeah,
Probably, since like probably like 2012, kind of the before I stepped down at Smule.
yeah,
And for the next some years, I was working on other projects, everything from like VR
yeah,
to writing Artful design, and there's like all these other
right.
projects. And even though thankfully people like Jack Atherton and others were working on things like Tunity and WebChuck, but this year it's been nothing short of like what someone's been calling it a Chuck development renaissance, and it's
Yeah,
because a lot of different things came together. I have to teach this music AI class. The other part of the next release that's big is actually the WebChuck part, which is already out
yeah,
there. But you can not only code Chuck on the web, but it's really so easy to integrate Chuck into any web page
yeah,
that you
yeah,
want to use, right? So, and because of suddenly there's all this interest, we have people like something like 10 people from different
yeah,
aspects suddenly converging and being like, go, let's add this to Chuck. Go, and that, like, I felt completely energized over the past year, over the past year, and that's got me back on the horse. And
yeah,
we'll see where good things go from here. And maybe you'll get back on the horse on Marcius, or whatever,
yeah.
or a number of other things that you've been working on.
Yeah, no, I think so. One big project that I'm working on is this, the Bible of Music Information Retrieval, which I was, ready to. I started working on it in 2008. I was planning for the 10-year anniversary. Then I missed the 10-year anniversary of the field. Then I was planning for the 20th year anniversary. Then I missed that too. I got the online course on Cadenzi, so that was a big piece of work, and that
Yeah.
gave me a lot of material. Like, I have a better idea of how to teach it. I have a lot of examples and demos and things like that. But I'm working on that, and I'm this synthesizer course I'm really enjoying because it kind of, there were a bunch of topics that I knew, coming from Perry. Of course, I have that synthesis thing, but I hadn't really dug into it as much historically or in terms of implementation. So kind of revisiting modal synthesis and the physical modeling stuff, and sort of looking back in time and looking at how these things were commercialized, and all sorts of things has been a lot of fun. So I'm kind of planning on some kind of, I don't know if it's going to be a book or online resource or a set of blog posts, but something that's kind of a synthesizer history, but weaved throughout with concepts from computer science, from programming languages, from HCI, from AI, and kind of making these connections. And so I'm excited about that too. And yeah, I'm thinking about programming languages and design, and I might jump into the wagon at some point. But yeah, for now we are where we are.
Well, you're one of the most productive people I've ever known. So whatever you do, I look forward to what's next
Yeah.
from George. And also let me know how I can help with any of those things to the extent I can. I'd be very happy to.
Oh yeah, I'll share you the resources for the course because you probably will find them also entertaining or useful, including like the amazing amount of crazy stuff that you can find now on YouTube, of people really going deep, or on the web on all sorts of stuff. Like it's crazy how much you can find and how many interesting people are doing interesting stuff that you used to not be able to access, but now it's there. So yeah, we will keep in touch. And I'm really interested also in the music and AI kind of course and looking into that. So
I'll shoot you an email with some links and including a few like short excerpts, actually PDFs from Artful Design, in case that's useful for students.
yeah, that'd be great. I have shown a bit of stuff from Artful, which is extremely entertaining too. I loved reading that book. I got it during COVID, and it was just like I don't know, the combination of being entertaining and also knowing a lot of the main characters.
Trip down memory lane.
Yeah, it's trip down memory lane, nostalgia, and just, in COVID, we all kind of went into a more, well, maybe that's a generalization, but a more reflective mode of what was before. We spend more time at home. So it was a perfect timing. I really enjoyed the Artful Design book.
So honored to hear that.
Yeah.
I'll send you a few links, including like there's a couple of classic synthesizer, like Jack Atherton's classic synth sounds, which sounds really good with like different pads and fuzzes. And
yeah, I saw that. I was looking at that webpage with a bunch of nice sounding Chuck sounds.
I was like, yeah, usually, we haven't really taken the time to make Chuck sound as nice in the examples. And Jack was like, I'm going to just make some nice sounds in Chuck.
Yeah, I know. It's funny, like I kind of, as part of the course, we are going through the synthesis toolkit, and you notice there is this like almost, this example used to be in the synthesis toolkit. Now this example is in Chuck.
Yeah.
And, and the other thing I tell the students always is, whatever you do, put a reverb in the end.
The ketchup of computer music.
It's sort of like salt and pepper in food. Like
exactly.
If you don't include that, it won't sound as good, and if you include it, it will always sound good.
It's a good relish.
Yeah. Good. Well, fantastic talking to you. Thanks so much for taking the time, and we will be in touch and maybe see each other in the real verse.
That would be fantastic.
And yeah, I do plan to head south at kind of Bay Area Karma at some point, so we'll get to talk to each other. And by the way, we did a really nice project with a student on sonification, kind of a sonification toolkit that was built in Tunity.
Oh, so cool.
That was a neat little thing.
Well, fantastic. And I just want to say again two things. Like, it's so good to see you, even just over Zoom. I feel it instantly kind of brought me back. Like, I feel like this is the place where I felt so at home, and that was Princeton Sound Lab and in our lab. And the other thing is that talking to you, this is this conversation has made me like even more energized. Like I'm gonna go write some code on Chuck right after this. So,
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
thank
Take
you.
care.
Take
Bye.
care.